The rifle appeared through the smoke before the man carrying it did. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the fighting had slowed to the strange, dangerous silence that comes after artillery. Then a single shot cracked across the valley. Not the heavy burst of a machine gun, not the rapid chatter of an assault rifle. One shot, a pause, another. The soldiers on the other side knew almost immediately that someone was watching them from far beyond the comfortable range of an ordinary infantry rifle. They did not know exactly where. They did not know how many rounds the shooter carried, and they did not yet understand why the weapon was firing so quickly for something they had been taught to think of as a sniper rifle. That contradiction would follow Western military observers for decades. The rifle was called the SVD. In the West, it became known simply as the Dragunov. It looked like a sniper rifle. It carried a scope. It fired a full-power rifle cartridge. It had a long barrel, a precision-oriented stock, and a reputation that grew with every conflict in which Soviet-designed weapons appeared. But the more NATO armies examined it, the stranger the weapon became. It was not quite a conventional sniper rifle. It was not an ordinary infantry rifle. It was not a machine gun, and it was not designed around the same battlefield philosophy that shaped many Western precision weapons. The Soviet Union had built something in between, and that in-between was the entire point. The mystery begins with a question that seems simple until the rifle is placed inside the Cold War battlefield. Why would the Soviet Union need a new sniper rifle at all? The Red Army already had decades of experience with precision rifles. Soviet snipers had become legendary during the Second World War. The Mosin Nagant, fitted with an optical sight, had served marksmen from Stalingrad to the forests of Eastern Europe. But the battlefield of the 1960s was changing. The Soviet infantryman was no longer expected to fight with the same type of rifle carried by his American or British counterpart in the Second World War. The Soviet Union had adopted the AK family and the intermediate 7.62 x 39 mm cartridge for ordinary infantry. That gave soldiers a compact, controllable weapon, optimized for the close and medium ranges where assault rifle combat was expected to dominate. NATO, meanwhile, had standardized the 7.62 x 51 mm NATO cartridge for its new generation of battle rifles and machine guns. The Soviet leadership understood the problem. On a battlefield dominated by automatic weapons, Soviet infantry could potentially find themselves outranged by NATO troops carrying full-power rifles and by enemy machine guns positioned beyond the most useful range of their standard assault rifles. The solution was not to give every Soviet soldier a heavier rifle. That would undermine the advantages of the new infantry system. The solution was to give one specially trained soldier in the squad or platoon a weapon that could reach farther. The rifle had to move with the infantry. It had to survive the same mud, snow, dust, and abuse. It had to fire more than one round without manually cycling a bolt, and it had to be accurate enough to threaten important targets at distances where the ordinary assault rifle became less effective. That requirement created a problem that was much harder than simply building a rifle with a better scope. A true precision rifle and a mass infantry weapon are designed around different priorities. Precision demands rigidity, consistency, ammunition quality, and a stable firing platform. Infantry demands mobility, reliability, simplicity, and the ability to keep functioning when everything around the soldier is dirty, wet, frozen, or damaged. The Soviet designers were being asked to combine both worlds, and the man who eventually solved the problem was not initially the obvious choice. His name was Yevgeny Fyodorovich Dragunov. He had worked at the Izhevsk weapons factory and had experience with sporting and target rifles. He was also a competitive marksman. But the competition for the new Soviet rifle included experienced weapons designers such as Sergei Simonov and Alexander Konstantinov. In 1958, Dragunov entered the contest with his own design. What followed was not one dramatic flash of genius, but years of prototypes, trials, modifications, and competition. The The Soviet military tested different approaches because it was not looking for the prettiest rifle. It was looking for a weapon that could survive the reality of mechanized warfare. The first designs were not simply scaled-up versions of existing Soviet rifles. That distinction mattered. Dragunov had to create a rifle that was light enough for an infantryman, strong enough to use the powerful 7.62 x 54 mm R cartridge, and accurate enough to fulfill the military's expectations. The old cartridge itself was part of the answer. The 7.62 x 54 mm R had been born in the Russian Empire in the 19th century and had survived revolutions, 2 world wars, and the birth of the Soviet Union. It was powerful, long-ranged, and already deeply embedded in Soviet ammunition production. The Red Army used it in machine guns, such as the PK family, as well as other weapons. So the new rifle did not require the Soviet Union to create an entirely new ammunition ecosystem. The cartridge already existed. The challenge was to make a semi-automatic rifle around it without making the weapon excessively heavy or excessively delicate. By the early 1960s, Dragunov's design had separated itself from the competition. Semenov's proposal was rejected earlier in the process, while Konstantinov's rifle presented a serious alternative. The Soviet trials were extensive, and the competing rifles were tested under demanding conditions. The final decision came in 1963. The Soviet Army adopted Dragunov's rifle as the 7.62 mm sniper rifle SVD model 1963. The designation itself is revealing. The weapon was officially categorized as a sniper rifle, but its battlefield role was closer to what many Western militaries would later call a designated marksman rifle. It was intended to extend the reach of ordinary infantry formations, not replace every specialized sniper team. That distinction would become one of the biggest sources of misunderstanding surrounding the weapon. The rifle looked different because it had been asked to do something different. Its barrel was long enough to exploit the 7.62 x 54 mm R cartridge without turning the weapon into a giant precision platform. Its gas system operated the action automatically after each shot. The shooter did not have to lift and cycle a bolt between rounds. That meant the weapon could fire another aimed shot much faster than a conventional bolt-action sniper rifle. But automatic operation came with a cost. Every moving part inside the rifle represented another source of vibration and movement. The designers, therefore, had to find a balance between precision and self-loading reliability. The SVD used a short-stroke gas piston system and a rotating bolt. When the rifle fired, propellant gases were tapped from the barrel. Those gases drove the piston, which moved the operating mechanism and unlocked the bolt. The empty cartridge case was extracted and ejected. A fresh round was stripped from the magazine and chambered. The bolt locked again. The rifle was ready for the next shot. Simple in concept. Difficult in execution when the goal was to maintain precision. And then there was the magazine. 10 rounds. That number tells you almost everything about the Soviet concept. This was not an assault rifle. The shooter was not expected to fill the sky with bullets. But it was also not a traditional bolt-action sniper rifle where every shot was treated as an isolated event. 10 rounds gave the marksman enough ammunition to engage several targets without immediately reloading, while keeping the rifle compact and relatively light. The weapon could therefore support the movement of the platoon. A Soviet marksman could engage an exposed machine gun crew, an officer, an enemy marksman, or another important target, while the rest of the infantry closed the distance. The rifle was not simply supposed to kill one person at extreme range. It was supposed to change the geometry of the battlefield for an entire unit. That was the idea Western observers had to understand. The Dragunov was a precision weapon, but Soviet doctrine did not necessarily define precision warfare in exactly the same way that Western audiences imagined when they heard the word sniper. In the popular imagination, a sniper is an isolated figure, hidden hundreds of meters away, firing one carefully calculated shot and disappearing. The SVD belonged to a different tactical concept. It gave ordinary infantry formations a longer reach. It was a bridge between the assault rifle and the dedicated sniper weapon. And because the Soviet military placed this capability inside the infantry structure, the rifle could appear everywhere. A Western intelligence analyst looking at a Soviet unit could not simply ask, "Where are the snipers?" The more important question was, "Where is the man with the SVD?" That soldier was part of the formation. He moved with it. He trained with it. He fought with it. And his presence meant that a Soviet infantry unit could threaten targets at distances where its standard rifles were losing effectiveness. But the rifle's accuracy was not magic. That matters because the mythology surrounding the Dragunov eventually became almost as famous as the weapon itself. The SVD was never intended to behave like a modern custom-built precision rifle with match ammunition and an enormous optic. Its accuracy was good for the role it was designed to perform, but the weapon had to balance accuracy with reliability, weight, production, and battlefield practicality. Soviet doctrine placed the rifle in a role where rapid follow-up shots and useful accuracy mattered more than the extreme precision demanded from a specialized sniper system. That difference explains why the Dragunov could be both highly respected and misunderstood at the same time. It was excellent at what it was designed to do. It simply was not designed to do everything people later expected a sniper rifle to do. The scope made the rifle even more recognizable. The standard PSO-1 optical sight was developed alongside the SVD and became part of the system. It was a 4x24 optic, compact enough for infantry use, but powerful enough to help the shooter identify and engage targets at extended distances. It also contained a distinctive range-finding reticle. Instead of forcing the soldier to carry a separate rangefinder, the optic provided a built-in method of estimating target distance based on a known target size. The system was not simply a piece of glass mounted on the rifle. It was part of the Soviet solution to the problem of giving an ordinary infantry formation a practical long-range capability. That optic also reveals something about Soviet battlefield thinking. The rifle and sight were designed as a system. The soldier was not simply handed a bare rifle and told to improvise. The weapon, ammunition, optic, training, and tactical role were connected. The PSO-1 gave the marksman a clear sight picture, range estimation aids, and features suited to military use. The original sight even incorporated equipment related to the detection of early active infrared devices, reflecting the technological environment of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was building not just a rifle, but a package intended to work under the conditions its planners expected. Then came the part that would make Western intelligence analysts pay attention. The Dragunov began appearing outside Soviet training grounds. It spread through the Warsaw Pact and across countries that received Soviet military equipment. It was no longer simply an experimental answer to a Soviet infantry problem. It had become part of a broader military system. East German soldiers trained with Soviet-pattern weapons. Other Warsaw Pact forces adopted versions or derivatives of the same basic concept. Outside Europe, Soviet allies and client states received the rifle. Chinese production eventually produced its own SVD-derived designs. Romanian and Yugoslav rifles also adopted similar roles and visual characteristics. The Dragunov had become more than a Soviet rifle. It was becoming a template. For NATO, this created a familiar Cold War problem. The alliance had to understand not only what the Soviet Union built, but how Soviet forces intended to use it. Intelligence services collected photographs. Analysts studied captured examples. Soldiers encountered Soviet equipment during exercises, border confrontations, and later wars. Manuals described the weapon. Western troops trained against Soviet formations and learned to recognize the distinctive profile of the SVD. The rifle itself was not an unknown secret for decades. Its specifications and general purpose became well understood. The mystery was more subtle. Why had the Soviet Union placed so much emphasis on a semi-automatic precision rifle inside the ordinary infantry formation? And what did that tell NATO about how the Soviet army expected a future European war to unfold? The answer was uncomfortable. The Soviet army expected a war in which visibility, range, and tempo would matter enormously. Imagine a mechanized infantry unit advancing across open farmland. Trees are sparse, buildings are distant, smoke from artillery drifts over the horizon. NATO forces are somewhere beyond the next line of terrain. The Soviet assault rifle is powerful enough for close and medium combat, but an enemy machine gun position may be farther away. A platoon cannot simply stop and wait for the enemy to come closer. It needs a soldier who can reach across the gap. The SVD gives that soldier the ability to participate in the firefight without carrying a weapon so specialized that it slows the unit down. That is the real innovation. Not raw accuracy, not the scope, not the silhouette. The innovation was distribution. Precision was no longer reserved entirely for a tiny group of specialists. It became an organic capability within the infantry unit. That concept would eventually become familiar in Western armies too. But when the SVD entered Soviet service in 1963, it was a remarkably early expression of the designated marksman idea. Yet the rifle's first real battlefield test would not happen in the dramatic way Hollywood might suggest. There was no single moment when Dragunov's rifle proved itself and everyone suddenly understood it. Instead, its reputation accumulated slowly. Soldiers carried it through changing conflicts, changing climates, and changing political systems. The rifle traveled from Soviet garrisons into wars across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and eventually the post-Soviet battlefields of Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. Each conflict added another layer to the legend. Some soldiers praised its reach and reliability. Others criticized its limitations. Some users treated it as a sniper rifle. Others used it more like a designated marksman's rifle. The same weapon could look completely different depending on the doctrine and training of the army holding it. That was another problem for Western observers. The Dragunov did not have one universal identity. Its Soviet designers had created it for one role, but the world kept assigning it new ones. And then came Afghanistan. When Soviet forces entered Afghanistan in 1979, the SVD found itself in a battlefield very different from the European plains for which Soviet planners had imagined a major NATO war. Mountains replaced forests and farmland. Engagement distances could become enormous. Visibility could stretch across valleys. A rifle designed to extend the reach of an infantry platoon suddenly found itself operating in terrain where elevation, distance, concealment, and observation mattered even more. The SVD was not a miracle weapon in the mountains, but its combination of range, semi-automatic fire, and manageable weight made it useful. Soviet troops needed a rifle capable of reaching across spaces where an AK pattern rifle was at a disadvantage. The Dragunov filled that gap. But Afghanistan also exposed the weapon's limitations. The farther the engagement, the more ammunition quality, environmental conditions, shooter skill, optics, and ballistic knowledge mattered. A semi-automatic rifle, optimized for infantry use, could not simply become a dedicated long-range precision rifle because the mountains were farther away. The weapon could reach. That did not mean it could guarantee precision at every distance. The distinction between can hit at long range and is optimized for extreme precision became impossible to ignore. The Soviet soldier carrying the SVD therefore occupied a strange position. He was not the ordinary rifleman. He was not necessarily a specialized sniper. He was something between them. His job was to make the enemy feel exposed at distances where the rest of the squad could not answer effectively. In a firefight, that could be enough. And this is where the title of the Dragunov's legend begins to make sense. NATO did not spend decades literally trying to reverse engineer one mysterious Soviet rifle because nobody understood how it worked. Western militaries could inspect the weapon, they could measure it, they could acquire examples, they could train with it. The deeper challenge was understanding the battlefield philosophy behind it. The Dragunov forced Western analysts to confront a different answer to the question, what should a rifleman be able to do? The Soviet answer was not to turn every soldier into a precision marksman, it was to build precision into the formation. That distinction mattered during the Cold War because military planners were not comparing individual rifles in isolation. They were comparing systems. A NATO infantry squad with one weapon configuration faced a Warsaw Pact formation with another. The question was not simply whether an American rifle was more accurate than an SVD. The question was, what happened when thousands of soldiers were organized according to different assumptions about range, firepower, mobility, and target selection? And the Dragunov was one of the clearest physical expressions of those assumptions. The rifle's construction reflected the same philosophy. It had to be light enough to carry, but stable enough to shoot. The distinctive skeletonized or thumbhole-style stock of early versions gave the shooter a repeatable firing position while keeping the weapon relatively light. A cheek piece helped align the shooter's face with the optic. The long barrel provided the cartridge with a useful platform. The muzzle device reduced flash and moderated the weapon's behavior. The rifle was not built as a fragile target gun. It was built as military equipment. That meant compromises. The barrel was not simply made as heavy as possible to maximize accuracy. A heavy barrel can resist heating and vibration, but it adds weight. A soldier carrying a rifle through mountains, forests, urban streets, or mechanized operations pays for every extra kilogram. The Soviet designers therefore chose a balance. The rifle had to remain practical for infantry. The same principle applied to the optic. A gigantic magnification scope might help with target identification at extreme distances, but it would make the rifle slower, heavier, and less convenient. The PSO-1's relatively modest magnification was enough for its intended role. The weapon did not need to turn the soldier into a long-range competition shooter. It needed to give him an advantage over the enemy at distances where the standard rifle began to struggle. That was the genius of the design. And it was also its limitation. The Dragunov was never supposed to win a precision rifle competition. It was supposed to win a battlefield problem. The distinction becomes even clearer when compared with Western sniper systems. During the same general era, the United States was developing and fielding weapons such as the M21 sniper weapon system, derived from the M14. The M21, like the SVD, used a semi-automatic action and a full-power cartridge, but the institutional context was different. Western militaries continued to develop specialized sniper capabilities alongside infantry marksman roles. Soviet doctrine integrated the SVD much more directly into the ordinary infantry structure. Two rifles could therefore appear superficially similar while representing different ideas about how precision should be distributed across an army. This is why calling the SVD simply a Soviet sniper rifle is accurate only in the official sense. It was a sniper rifle by Soviet designation. In practical terms, it became one of the world's most recognizable early designated marksman weapons. And once the Cold War ended, the Dragunov's second life began. The Soviet Union disappeared in 1991. Its factories, armies, arsenals, and military industries were scattered across newly independent states. But the rifle remained. Thousands upon thousands of SVDs had already been produced and distributed. They did not disappear when the flag over the Kremlin changed. They moved into new wars. Chechnya became one of the most important environments in which the weapon continued to be used. Urban combat changed the problem again. Buildings created vertical firing positions. Streets created long corridors. Windows became firing points. A weapon that could deliver accurate fire while retaining semi-automatic follow-up capability was useful in the hands of a trained marksman. The Dragunov was old by then, but age did not make it irrelevant. The same pattern appeared across the former Soviet sphere. The rifle was cheap, compared with building an entirely new precision weapon ecosystem. Ammunition was widely available. Training systems already existed. Spare parts and institutional knowledge were established. Soldiers knew the weapon. Commanders knew what it could do. That is one of the least glamorous reasons military equipment survives for decades. Not because it is perfect, but because the entire organization already understands how to use it. By this point, Western armies were moving toward more specialized precision systems. Optics were becoming better. Ammunition was becoming more consistent. Materials and manufacturing methods were improving. Military snipers were using rifles designed specifically around extreme precision. Yet the Dragunov remained relevant because it was solving a different problem. Then the rifle acquired a reputation that sometimes exceeded its actual capabilities. Images of the SVD became instantly recognizable: the long barrel, the distinctive wooden or synthetic furniture, the scope-mounted offset over the receiver, the unusual stock, the curved magazine, the Soviet aesthetic. In films, video games, photographs, and war footage, the Dragunov became shorthand for sniper. That cultural image sometimes erased the tactical nuance. A viewer saw the rifle and imagined a hidden marksman operating at extreme range, but the real soldier carrying it was often doing something much more practical. He was extending the effective reach of his unit. This is one reason the rifle remained so difficult to categorize. A weapon can become famous for being something it technically is not. The SVD is the perfect example. It is a sniper rifle. It is a designated marksman rifle. It is a Soviet infantry support weapon. Depending on the context, all three descriptions can be defensible. The problem begins when one description is used to erase the others. And NATO's response over the decades was not one single program called Defeat the Dragunov. Instead, Western militaries developed broader responses to the battlefield capability, represented by weapons like the SVD. Better optics, better infantry weapons, better designated marksman systems, better body armor, better observation equipment, better counter-sniper doctrine, better training in identifying firing positions and suppressing distant marksmen. The goal was not necessarily to copy the Soviet rifle. It was to prevent the enemy from owning an uncontested advantage at the same ranges. That is a very different story from the myth that NATO simply stared at the Dragunov for decades and could not understand it. They understood the rifle. What they had to understand was the doctrine behind it. And doctrine is harder to copy than metal. You can capture a rifle, you can photograph it, you can disassemble it, you can measure the barrel, you can inspect the gas system, you can examine the optic. But none of that tells you exactly how an army intends to use 10,000 of those rifles across a continent. The Soviet answer was based on mass. One rifleman does not transform a battlefield. A formation containing thousands of riflemen with an extended range marksman capability does. That idea became especially important as infantry combat evolved after the Cold War. Western militaries increasingly recognized the value of designated marksmen who could operate within ordinary units while providing greater reach than standard assault rifles. Newer rifles, ammunition, optics, suppressors, rangefinders, and ballistic systems pushed the concept far beyond what Dragunov had offered in the 1960s. But the basic idea remained: give the squad someone who can reach farther. The Dragunov had anticipated that problem decades earlier. Its designers also understood something that modern armies still struggle with. Every improvement comes at a cost. A more accurate rifle may be heavier. A more powerful optic may be bulkier. A heavier barrel may improve consistency but slow the soldier. More ammunition means more weight. A more sophisticated weapon may demand more maintenance. The SVD's designers were not trying to eliminate these trade-offs. They were trying to choose the trade-off that best matched Soviet doctrine. That is why the rifle feels so different when you stop judging it by the standards of a modern precision rifle and start judging it by the problem it was actually built to solve. Suppose a Soviet platoon is moving across open ground. The enemy appears at a distance. The assault rifles can engage, but the target is near the edge of their useful effectiveness. The machine gun can reach, but its ammunition expenditure is high, and its position may be obvious. The SVD marksman takes position. He has an optic. He has a full-power cartridge. He can fire a controlled shot, observe the result, and fire again quickly if necessary. He can keep moving with the platoon. He does not need a dedicated sniper team to accompany him. The capability is already inside the unit. That is the battlefield problem the rifle solves. And once you see that, the entire design makes sense. The 10-round magazine makes sense. The semi-automatic action makes sense. The moderate optical magnification makes sense. The relatively light construction makes sense. The powerful cartridge makes sense. The rifle is not a compromise, because the designers failed to choose between a sniper rifle and an infantry rifle. The rifle is a compromise because the Soviet Army deliberately wanted both capabilities in one weapon. That is an important distinction. But the story contains another twist. The same characteristics that made the SVD useful also prevented it from becoming an unstoppable weapon. The semi-automatic action increased the rate of aimed fire, but it could not match the extreme precision of the best specialized bolt-action rifles. The rifle's relatively light construction helped mobility, but lighter components can be more sensitive to heat and firing conditions than the massive actions and barrels used by dedicated precision rifles. The standard optic was practical, but its magnification was modest by later standards. Ammunition quality varied across countries and decades. Training standards varied enormously, and the rifle's effectiveness depended on the shooter understanding what the weapon could realistically do. That last point is critical. The Dragunov's reputation sometimes encouraged people to expect too much from it. A rifle does not create a marksman. A scope does not create range estimation skill. A powerful cartridge does not eliminate wind. A semi-automatic action does not guarantee accuracy. And a weapon capable of reaching a target at long range is not automatically a precision weapon optimized for extreme distance competition. The Soviet system understood this through training and doctrine. Later users sometimes learned it the harder way. The rifle also had to coexist with an enormous technological transformation in warfare. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, infantrymen were gaining access to thermal sights, laser rangefinders, improved ballistic computers, modern optics, night vision systems, suppressors, advanced ammunition, and increasingly precise manufacturing. The battlefield was becoming less dependent on the naked eye and more dependent on sensors. The Dragunov could accept some of these developments, and many modernized versions have been fitted with newer optics and furniture. But the fundamental architecture remained recognizable. That is both its strength and its weakness. It was designed for an era when a soldier's eye, a scope, a cartridge, and experience were the primary tools of long-range infantry engagement. The modern battlefield increasingly adds cameras, drones, thermal imagers, digital communications, satellite navigation, and networked targeting. Yet the rifle still appears. That is not because nothing better exists. It is because better is always relative to the mission. A modern precision rifle may outperform an old SVD in accuracy. A modern optic may dramatically outperform the PSO-1. Modern ammunition can provide more consistent ballistic performance. Modern designated marksman rifles can be built around improved cartridges and accessories. But the SVD remains attractive because it is already there. It is rugged. It is familiar. It uses a cartridge that has been produced for generations. It can deliver semi-automatic fire. It is relatively compact for a full-power rifle, and millions of soldiers have learned the basic logic of the weapon. That is why military technology often survives longer than its designers expect. Not because the weapon is frozen in time, because logistics are not. A military does not replace a rifle simply because a newer rifle exists. It replaces it when the cost of keeping the old system becomes greater than the cost of transition. Until then, the old rifle continues to work. The Dragunov is one of the clearest examples of this principle. Its service life crossed the Soviet period and continued through the post-Soviet era. It entered service in 1963 and remains in military use in various forms more than 6 decades later. The Soviet Union is gone. The Warsaw Pact is gone. The Cold War is gone. Yet the rifle designed for that Cold War remains recognizable on battlefields and in arsenals. And the man who designed it did not build a legend around himself. Yevgeny Dragunov was a weapons engineer working inside a massive Soviet industrial system. His rifle emerged from a competition involving other talented designers. It was subjected to testing and refinement. It was not the product of a single dramatic revelation. It was the result of a design process in which the Soviet military defined a problem and several engineers attempted to solve it. Dragunov's success was not that he invented the sniper rifle. The Soviet Union already had sniper rifles. His achievement was understanding what the Soviet infantry needed next. That difference is what made his name endure. The rifle also reveals something about the Soviet military-industrial system that is easy to miss when looking only at the finished weapon. Soviet weapons were often judged by a different hierarchy of priorities than Western small arms enthusiasts might expect. Reliability, mass production, logistics, battlefield practicality, and integration into doctrine could matter as much as raw technical performance. The Dragunov had to be manufactured in quantity. It had to be issued across formations. It had to be maintained by soldiers who were not laboratory technicians. It had to function in climates ranging from the Arctic cold to desert heat. The weapon therefore became a compromise, engineered with unusual discipline. It did not attempt to become the world's most accurate rifle. It attempted to become the world's most useful rifle for a very specific military problem. And that is why the rifle's greatest legacy is not its silhouette. It is the idea behind the silhouette. The idea that a squad should not be forced to choose between firepower and precision. The idea that one soldier can extend the reach of an entire formation. The idea that the marksman does not have to disappear from the infantry battle to become useful. That idea would continue to evolve. Western armies developed modern designated marksman rifles. Soviet and Russian forces developed new variants and replacement systems. Other countries produced their own rifles inspired by or derived from the SVD. China developed the NDM-86 and related systems. Romania produced the PSL, which resembles the Dragunov but is mechanically distinct. Yugoslavia developed the Zastava M76 and later M91. The SVD became a family of ideas as much as a single rifle. But there is another reason the Dragunov remained important. It became a symbol of Soviet military thinking. The AK represented the Soviet answer to the ordinary infantry rifle. The PK represented the machine gun problem. The SVD represented something different. It represented reach. A Soviet formation, armed primarily with assault rifles, could still project accurate rifle fire beyond the range where the average infantryman was most effective. That meant an enemy could not simply assume that distance alone provided safety. A hilltop, a window, a road junction, a machine gun position, a vehicle crew, a commander exposed briefly in the open. The SVD gave the infantry another option. And in war, options are power. This is also why the Dragunov story cannot be reduced to the claim that NATO couldn't replace it. NATO did not need to replace the SVD, because NATO did not field the SVD as a standard weapon in the first place. Western militaries developed their own solutions to the same broader battlefield requirement. What they could not simply ignore was the capability represented by the weapon. The Soviet Union had recognized a gap. NATO recognized the same gap. Different armies filled it differently. That is the more historically accurate version of the story. And perhaps the most interesting part is that both sides eventually moved toward the same conclusion. Infantry formations needed soldiers who could reach beyond the normal engagement envelope without sacrificing mobility. The Dragunov simply arrived at that conclusion early. In 1963, that made it unusual. By the 21st century, it made the underlying concept look almost obvious. That is how military innovation often works. The revolutionary weapon eventually becomes ordinary. The strange idea becomes doctrine. The doctrine becomes standard equipment. And then people forget how strange the idea looked when it first appeared. For the Soviet soldier receiving an SVD in the 1960s, the weapon was not a piece of Cold War mythology. It was equipment, a rifle to clean, a scope to zero, ammunition to carry, a weapon to take into the field. For Western intelligence analysts, it was evidence of something larger. For soldiers who later faced it, it was a sound in the distance. One shot, then another. And somewhere between those shots was the central idea that made the rifle dangerous. The shooter did not have to be 100 meters away. He did not have to be a legendary sniper. He only had to be farther away than the enemy expected. That was enough. The Dragunov story therefore ends where it began, with distance. The Soviet Union did not create the SVD because it wanted a glamorous sniper rifle. It created the rifle because its infantry doctrine had created a gap. Standard assault rifles were excellent at the ranges for which they were designed, but modern mechanized warfare demanded a soldier who could reach farther. The SVD filled that space. It gave the infantry a full-power cartridge, an optic, semi-automatic fire, and enough accuracy to threaten important targets beyond the comfortable range of the standard rifle. It was officially a sniper rifle, but functionally, it became one of history's earliest and most influential examples of the designated marksman concept. And that explains why NATO spent so much time studying the weapon and the doctrine around it. Not because the rifle was impossible to understand, because it was easy to misunderstand. A Western observer could look at the SVD and see a sniper rifle. The Soviet Army looked at it and saw a formation capability. That difference was everything. The rifle was not designed to make one man into an invisible superhuman. It was designed to make an infantry unit harder to outrange. That is a much more practical idea, and perhaps a more dangerous one, because a weapon does not have to be perfect to change a battlefield. It only has to solve the problem its designers were actually facing. Yevgeny Dragunov solved his. The SVD entered Soviet service in 1963. More than 60 years later, its descendants and original examples continue to appear in military inventories and battlefields around the world. The Soviet state that created it vanished. The Cold War that gave it purpose ended. The technology surrounding it transformed beyond recognition. Yet the rifle remains. Not because it defeated every weapon that came after it. Not because it was the most accurate sniper rifle ever made. Not because NATO was incapable of understanding how it worked. It survived because the problem it solved never completely disappeared. Infantry still needs reach. Commanders still need accurate fire beyond the range of ordinary rifles. Soldiers still need weapons that can move with them, and every generation eventually discovers the same uncomfortable truth. On a battlefield, the most important weapon is rarely the one with the most impressive specification sheet. It is the one that gives a soldier an advantage at exactly the moment the enemy believes he has none. The Dragunov was built to create that moment. For the Soviet Union, it was a solution to a Cold War problem. For NATO, it became a window into Soviet doctrine. For generations of soldiers, it became a familiar silhouette on the far side of the battlefield. And for military history, it became something more lasting. A reminder that sometimes the most influential weapons are not the ones that completely replace what came before. They are the ones that quietly change what an infantryman is expected to be able to do. The Dragunov did exactly that. It did not turn every Soviet soldier into a sniper. It did something more useful. It put a marksman's reach inside the formation. And once that idea entered modern warfare, it was almost impossible to take it back.